Hello Internet, welcome to Lame Theory, the show that's idea was not about to go to waste when it was scrapped during the development of this video. Okay, so cringe map pat impressions aside, it's not an understatement to say that my hype for Xenoblade 3 is at a critical point, and with the game being less than a week away, the hype train has almost reached its next stop. But before we get there, I've got just one last batch of theories and predictions to get out now based on all the new info we've received since the game was initially shown off in February. Now I'm sure I'm not alone in being one of the people who've drastically slowed down looking at new info since the previews dropped at the start of the month. However, I've still been following Monopon's tweets, so there may be questions I bring up that already have answers, but without further delay, let's get to it. Starting out, I'm going to be breaking down a rough outline of the way I think the story is going to play out. Specifically, the fact that I think the game is going to be broken up into 10 chapters again like Xenoblade 2. So get comfortable, as for the first 2 chapters, I proceed to be as specific as possible to make sure this video ages incredibly poorly when the game finally arrives. So starting out, Chapter 1 will take place 9 years before the main plot, and after the opening cutscene we'll be following the perspective of a young Noah as he goes about his daily life. Because Kevis has roots to Xenoblade 1, I imagine the opening is going to share some similarities. So while going about this new Colony 9, we'll then be introduced to Uni, Lanz, Xeon, and this new character who I'll be naming Toby. Eventually, Agnes' soldiers will strike Colony 9 and our party will be forced to flee. It's at this point, when this cutscene happens, and then Ethel rescues Noah and the gang. However, not long after, Toby will sacrifice themselves in order to allow others more time to escape. This loss causes Noah to question why both sides have to keep on fighting, as well as wanting to become an Offseer, thus ending the chapter. And then Chapter 2 starts in Colony 6, with Noah, Uni and Lanz receiving a special mission from the Queen, to find and capture Vandam after reports he poses a threat to the safety of Kevis. They are also instructed that it's possible a team from Agnes are being sent with a similar objective. This is where we'll enter our first big area of the game, Sartl Marsh, which is just a mashup of Tantal and Sartl Marsh. This is where Noah's group will first cross paths with Mio's team and begin battling. That is until Mr. Wild Ride shows up and decimates both parties. However, not long after, Vandam will appear and trigger Noah and Mio's Ouroboros form. After successfully causing Mr. Wild Ride to retreat, the newly formed party heads to Vandam, thus ending the chapter. Okay, so from now on I'm going to be a bit more vague with the outline. Starting off, I think the first half of the story is going to suffer slightly from a formula in regards to meeting the characters that will end up being our heroes. I'm going to say each chapter will unlock 2 heroes until Chapter 6, and based off of cross-referencing these 2 images, I imagine we'll be unlocking heroes and visiting places in this order. Now keeping on the topic of heroes, as you can see that in the direct they blurred one. Now I have to ask myself, why would they do this? Based on everything we know so far, it has to be a character introduced early enough into the story to be first on the list, but important enough where fans seeing that character would spoil something big. Which is why my first bold prediction is that this character will be Dromark. Now there are problems with this, the first being that Mio already provides the class Dromark would bring to the party. However, my theory to counter this is perhaps something has happened to Dromark that has changed his weapon, or he'll only be a temporary hero, as he's accompanying the party through the first few chapters. Although I don't know how well the concept of temporary heroes sits with me, but it's not something the Xenoblade series hasn't done before. Now Chapter 7 is where I think the story will go crazy. I'd say up to this point, the plot has been more or less about heading to an area, stopping the conflict currently happening, foiling the true enemy's plans, and then finally arriving at Sword's March. And although Chapter 7 would be late into the story, I think it will function very similarly to Prison Island from Xenoblade 1, rather than the Cliffs of Moratha from Xenoblade 2, in which it turns out the leader of the true enemy is Noah from the future. Okay, now I know that's not anything particularly groundbreaking, as I mean if you just put them side by side you can see the similarities. However, where I was confused was when the first trailers dropped and I was under the assumption that the queens of each nation were evil, but now I'm not so sure. Although this doesn't have a lot of ground, I'm going to say future Noah somehow failed to keep Mio alive and break the cycle of fate, and now with a new pessimistic outlook, he was able to travel back in time and force the queens to submit in order to maintain the cycle of fate. Now everyone, before we go any further, I'm going to suggest holding on to something, as from this point we're about to go deep into headcanon. I'm talking seriously lost in the sauce. Alright, so before we carry on with my predictions for the main plot, I'm going to talk about the DLC expansion. Based on this image, you can assume that the story is going to feature Noah, Rex and Shulk. Now my first thought was that it was going to be an after story, as Shulk and Rex were going to appear in the base game, but now I've conjured up something much more dark. I think the DLC story is going to be the fleshed out backstory of future Noah. I think this because going off of my theory that the queens of each nation are being forced to fight each other, I personally don't see why they wouldn't have been able to coexist when the first contact was made. Although Shulk's appearance in Xenoblade 2 isn't canon, we can see how easily our protagonists were able to get along. And yes, there is a lot of wishful thinking, but come on. We know who they are, so why wouldn't they be able to be friends? This is why I think that in the timeline future Noah is from, he initially travelled with an older Shulk and Rex, with the party essentially on the same quest as the main story. However, they lose to the final boss as perhaps they didn't have the power of a Boris. Noah is kept alive, but is sent back in time in order to strengthen our final boss. Now allow me to elaborate on why I'm going to say that Shulk and Rex won't appear in the base game. This is because future Noah kills them first, as they pose the biggest threat to his plans. However, I've conveniently left out a few characters from my theory, but this is where the main story comes back into play. So from chapter 8 to the finale, this is where any more past characters are going to appear. There will be another all-out attack from both nations where this cutscene takes place, and you're going to have to choose a side, either Agnes or Kevis, and depending on your choice, either Ethel or Kamaravi will die, with the other joining you as a hero, and eventually after this battle, you'll arrive at a relatively untouched Fonset village, which is where you'll meet, you guessed it, Pyra and Mithra. Now initially I thought they would join you as a hero, but based on the news for Shulk's amiibo, assumably the Pyra and Mithra amiibo would do the same. So unless they've had a weapon change like my Dromark theory, then it wouldn't make much sense, which is why I think starting chapter 9, we'll get our final hero. So after talking with Pyra and Mithra, the party learns of the final boss and how they were able to control time in order to gain more power. However, after the loss of Rex and what's happened in this world, they no longer have any interest in fighting. But that's when Alvis appears. Now I personally want Alvis to appear much earlier in the story, but I think he'll appear right at the end and be our final unlockable hero. He'll guide the party to the location of our final boss, probably in space, teach the party how to fuse into the ultimate Ouroboros, and then we'll get a bombshell that connects the final boss to the ganglion from Xenoblade X. Okay, so I know I can't just go dropping crazy theories like that without some evidence, but I got nothing. I just think connecting it to the Xenoblade X lore would be the wildest thing I can imagine. Well, I can think of one more, but that'd be a huge spoiler, so I'll leave that. Anyway, Noah and the gang demonstrate the tried and true power of friendship, topple the final boss, and liberate Ionios from the true enemy. But there are still things I've left out, which as we reach the end of this video, I'd like to go over just a few more crazy theories. First, Zeke. I think he will appear. Now although I said we wouldn't have any more old characters appearing until chapter 8, I think Zeke will have a role similar to his first few appearances in Xenoblade 2, that being just a side character who pops up now and again for comic relief. But now he's not as strong as he used to be, so he doesn't join the main party and continues as a travelling adventurer. Second, Poppy. So while I don't think the DLC heroes are going to be old characters, I think Poppy will appear in the main story, but I'm conflicted between her being a secret weapon from Agnes that would appear in chapter 8, or just being relegated to a super boss, although I think that outcome would be unfair on Poppy as a character. And finally, everything else. So I think this game will close a trilogy. At first I thought this game would heavily depend on knowledge of Xenoblade 1 and 2, but now I'm not so sure. I think the story will probably be completely standalone, that is until the DLC story. I also think both queens will survive, and future Noah's character arc will end similarly to Jin's. But that's it! I've exhausted all my theories, so now we wait for a few short days until we all have the game in our hands. And I'm never going to want to return to this video again, because I don't want to cringe at how horribly wrong I was. But it's all a bit of fun at the end of the day. So with that said, if you like what I'm doing here, subscribe. And as always, that's just a theory. A lame theory. Thanks for watching.